My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, a wizard did it.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
A Wizard is a 65-page system-agnostic dungeon crawl written and laid out by Ripley Caldwell, with artwork by Llewellyn Allwood, additional writing by Jonathan Wojcik, and maps by Johan Nohr. From the book. A wizard, mad with power, has terrorized the charming hamlet of Canny before escaping to his tower on the hill. The heroes must find him and stop him before his curses descend upon every hapless citizen. However, as the reader and characters will soon discover, that little description doesn't even begin to explain what's going on in this horrific dungeon crawl.
The contents begin with a single rule. The wizard is just that. He wears a pointed hat. Never refer to him as anything else. From there, we have a section on the aforementioned village of Canny, its shops and other significant town features, important NPCs, and importantly, a mystery stemming from a wanted poster featuring a wizard, eyes crossed out. The exact nature of this wizard's crimes are a little hard to pin down, though there are some clues connected to missing young people and cows being skinned alive. Next is a section called The Tower on the Hill. You get the basic of the wizard's tower, including its eerie light blue color, strange sweet smell, its rather organic nature, and dilating doors that automatically open when you approach them. You also learn the basic rules of the wizard himself, and how he stalks the player characters from the series of ventilation shafts throughout the tower. From there we have the dungeon crawl proper, with keyed locations for 5 different floors, most of which have about 5 chambers. The keyed locations contain all manner of body horror gross-outs, weird magical traps, and other dangers, but the important things to keep in mind for our purposes are that the wizard is actually a xenomorph-like insectoid horror that lays eggs that hatch new wizardlings. The young people missing from Canny have been transformed into wizards' apprentices, essentially grotesque, gibbering incubators for wizardlings. The upper floors of the tower are connected to the Abyss, a vast extra-dimensional space where the player characters can have many more encounters and adventures. The wizard itself can be confronted in the uppermost portion of the tower, or even earlier if the player characters threaten its eggs, at which point it will try to drag the player characters into the ventilation shafts. Next comes a section called Possible Endings, where possible endings are discussed. Finally comes a 30-page section, nearly half the book, on the Abyss, and the 15 or so encounters you can have there. Let's talk about our bona fides, Tom.
Mine are minimal. I have read it and pondered it. How about you?
I have run it in 3 sessions using Trophy Gold.
Nice.
Let's start talking about things we liked about a wizard. And I think we should just kick off as we usually do with presentation things. I thought the illustrations and the maps were quite good, and in play, they both did a really terrific job of selling the vibe of this module to my players. I could just post a few of these pictures and maps, and the players totally got what the space was about. What'd you think of the visuals?
Yeah, I can really see that as well. The maps I found quite impressive because they have this very dark, they're almost inverted white on black in their colour scheme.
Right.
And they have that sort of like the iconography is not obvious to you when you first look at it, but it's one of those ones where you just take a few minutes of looking at it and then you've got it, which I think is good. The actual illustrations didn't grab me at first, but then as I was reading along and I realised they were illustrating specific scenes that you could show to people, then I got into it and I was like, okay, this is... Actually, this seemingly maybe a bit prosaic depiction of a thing is good because that's what it's for, you know?
They've illustrated like key moments from the dungeon and you show those key moments and it's like a really surprisingly almost like utilitarian selection of spot illustrations in terms of like just the quality of them and like the enjoyment of them. I was about like 80% of the way there with it. There were a few that I thought were not as good as the others, but some of them were quite good. Like the one with the Wizard's Apprentice and the thing coming out of its mouth is really good.
For sure. Yeah, and really I think the wanted poster is a real highlight as well because it's sort of cheery in the way that the wizard's head is drawn, but also menacing because his eyes are being scratched out in the picture and stuff. And it's very nice. Yeah, I like it.
Well, it's like the crux of the mystery, right? Like you show the players that wanted poster and they're in it. They want to know like what's going on, right? Like even if they don't know anything else about the module, they're intrigued by this wanted poster. And so it's very effective in that way. I thought the layout was generally clean and quite readable, very easy to navigate. The one thing that made it particularly easy to navigate is that each keyed location in the dungeon has a single word title, which was really helpful for helping me keep in my mind what was happening on each level of the dungeon, because I think sometimes you can read through a dungeon, and I always do. I always read ahead, but you don't necessarily keep immediately in your mind like what each room is. You always have to go back and read a little bit every time you go to that space. But these one-word titles were really effective at pinging my brain what this space is. So, for example, one of them is likeness. And this is a room that has a statue that has a likeness of one of the PCs. There's another one called Keys, which is where this particularly good encounter
horrific
for acquiring some keys takes place. And another one called Lights for a room with dangerous motes of light and so forth.
Yeah. Some of those seemed a bit abstract to me, but I guess all they have to do is trigger your memory. So
that's
doesn't matter.
Yeah, their abstraction is almost helpful. It's like a word association, right? So I thought it was really, really good. In general, I thought the presentation was pretty good, and I like some of the support things built into it, and the illustrations and stuff were nice. Any other thoughts about surface level stuff?
Does the format of the entries, I guess that's pretty surface level. So the way that each keyed location is laid out, you get first glance and then details and then hidden things. Now, that's not very new in itself. We've seen that around a lot, but I thought, and I guess this is an overall thing, I thought it was really well done in terms of putting the right words into the right sections of that. Right? Is that
correct? Yeah, that's a great observation. Yes, that's exactly how it is in play too. The at a glance stuff was particularly helpful because this is one of those things where even a really skilled GM, you have to keep a lot of things in your head and you have to manage a lot of things at the table that the other people at the table don't have to manage. And it's very helpful to take that bit of cognitive load off your plate when the characters just walk into a space and you can just look at the one sentence that says at a glance and say that. But that initial at a glance thing, that's why I actually really liked boxed text. I'm a big fan of boxed text and italicized text.
You even could use this as box text almost if you were to warn people, I'm just going to read out a list of sensations that you have when you walk into rooms now, and that's how we're going to do this.
Yeah.
So,
so presentationally, I thought it was really solid. Yeah, it's good stuff. So let's get to the more substantive matters here. My players really enjoyed Canny, the village. What did you think about it from a read?
Yeah, I think the village is my favourite part, which is maybe not ideal from the designer's point of view because it's really meant to be a preamble, but I really like how it's only got 4 locations. It's got a little mystery going on, and all of those locations, they have weird effects that the wizard has had, and they point you on to the next bit quite easily, but it feels organic, like it's not really a railroady, do this, then this, and this. It's just that they will mention another family, and that family happens to be at the next hut down the road. And so,
right. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Was that how it was in play?
Yeah, it was great. My players really, really liked it. And a lot of that is probably down to the fact that I like weird mystery villages and I like running them. But the mysteries in this particular village are pretty cool. And they're presented in a way that makes you want to figure out what's going on, see that wanted poster, without really telling you exactly what is going on. It's seemingly a sort of bucolic setting, right? I mean, I think it even to the point of where the name Canny is a total feint, right?
Yes.
For what is going on there. And also the fact that all the characters have names that are their job, which seems a little goofy on the surface, but when you get into it, it almost feels like the setup. It's the players are in on the joke. Okay, the blacksmith's last name is Smith and the general store owner's last name is Stock. Okay, the village is called Canny. They're already in this headspace of I am being set up for something here, right?
Yeah,
there is clearly a setup going on here. And that's how my players responded to it. They perceived all of that stuff as oh, this is a total setup and I want to see where this is going to go. And so it was a lot of fun in that way. The more subtle thing that the Mystery Village does is this distinction it makes between a wizard and the wizard. Those two phrases are really important to how the overall module goes. And when the text makes references to either a wizard or the wizard, you should absolutely follow it. GMs, pay attention to that part of it and do what it says and speak about the characters in the way that it says, because it has such a big bearing on the overall flow of the dungeon part. and the player's understanding of the dungeon part. And so I don't want to go into it more than that, except to say that it's a seemingly meaningless distinction, but actually is not. It has a lot of meaning, and you should stick with it. There's this sort of like mismatching stories about why the wizard needs to be destroyed, which is kind of fun. The villagers behave really strangely, especially if you begin to talk about certain aspects of the situation. They like physically seize up or behave in a weird way. The village just has so many interesting little things going on. My players were super hype about it, and they were ready to get to the tower. Like they felt so ready to get to the tower. They're like, yes, I'm ready to go. I want to know what this is all about. So it was very successful in that way.
Yeah, it's great. It reads really well. I think, and the figure of the wizard is super interesting because, I mean, if you were to disassociate the things it does from the term the wizard and not like think about things through the fantasy lens, then it probably does become a bit more mundane, or a bit more expected. Yeah. It's like an alien. Yeah. But of course, that's the real key, and I think that's why it's so important to have that instruction right up the top. Only refer to him as the wizard.
Right.
Partly that's psychological priming on your players, but it's also on you as well. It's to stop you from going into full Lovecraftian mode and like describing it as, the tentacled entity or something. It's the wizard. The wizard is now like crawling around on multiple legs or whatever it is he does. I forget now. It prevents you from doing too much, basically, from giving too many details. Yeah.
Well, and the distinction between a wizard and the wizard is so fun and subtle, because essentially what's going on there is whenever you're saying a wizard, you are almost like making the wizards into a species. It's a note about how it's a species. Whereas when you say the wizard, you are clearly trying to situate perceptions in the realm of fantasy. And I love that. Like, it's so subtle, but it's so good. And I don't even know if this is what Ripley intended. I assume it is, because that's how it comes off.
I think it is. And it's also something you can steal for anything you're going to write down for yourself or others as well. So I have, I had a sort of otherworldly, dreamlike character in a scenario I wrote some time ago now. One of these days I'll release City of Light so other people can read it. But this professor figure he's literally actually a dream projection of himself who's slumbering below. And I made a note for myself quite extensively to never refer to him as walking anywhere or describing his feet. So he always drifts across the room or even just comes and goes, but never to actually describe how he's moving. Because that's probably not that important, but it's about priming your own way of describing things. Similar to like how you might give an accent to a voice for a character, descriptions can also do the same thing, and that's what's happening here, I think. And I think it works really well.
I think so too. And as we've talked about many times on this show, a lot of what we do in running a game operates almost on a subconscious level.
Yeah.
Theme is usually the playground we play in as far as that goes. But there's also something to be said about your choice of language, the way and whether and how you describe things. All that stuff like functions, right? It all like has a function in the way that it plays on the player's subconsciouses. And I think it's super cool. Okay, so other things. As a general matter, the players always felt really out of sorts in this dungeon. They couldn't ever quite get a hold of what was happening in this adventure, and that was basically the case all the way through to the end. But one of my players did say, I've never had so much fun being so confused, because the dungeon is truly confusing. I think on purpose, but importantly, the players loved it. They loved it. All of them were like, I'm going to go buy this as soon as we're done so I can just read it and see the details. Like, I want to know what was happening here. And I had to burst their bubble a little and say, well, I'm going to tell you, a lot of it's not really explained.
Yeah, that is true.
But I have thoughts on this, and I think we'll get to it when we get to the questions part. But I'm making it sound like a negative thing, but it's not. The fact that the players were always on the back foot, they were always a little confused. They were always like it was a huge, huge bonus for me, because the players enjoyed it, and they always wanted to go to the next level. They always wanted to go around the next quarter. They just had to know they always wanted to get closer to the truth of the matter. And I think that's good.
Yeah, that's what you want, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Some other things here. Yeah, the dungeon, of course, is very weird. Its references are obvious at times. I think Alien is probably the most significant one, or just generally body horror. But it's subverted just enough to make you feel a little unmoored again, such as everything being this sort of weird shade of blue and smelling like cotton candy. Just details like that, I think, make it stand out and make it a little more unique.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing. This is sort of related advice. This is one of those dungeons where I actually think it's best not to try to understand everything perfectly before you run it. I spent a fair amount of time trying to like just understand this environment. And I think that was kind of a mistake. I think the right thing to do is to know generally what's going to happen, but otherwise go with it. Present things as they are presented in the text and let the players swim around, sometimes literally so, in this weirdness. That is the way to do this.
And I think it's feasible with it, because when I was reading all these entries, I did note that it seemed to be the kind of thing you could almost zero prep, or maybe you could like prep it the previous week, forget about it, and then come back and pick it up. Like every room is...
Which is kind of what I did.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
well, fair enough.
yeah.
Right,
Yeah, that's essentially what I did.
It, yeah. So, everything is like, there's a door leading this way to this room and that way to that way. It's not the kind of dungeon where it assumes you're looking at the map, for example.
Right.
It just always keeps telling you which way, what it looks like when you look in this direction, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it's pretty supportive.
Because it's a tower structure, you don't have to worry too much about, corridors are this long. When they turn left, they turn right. You don't have to do all that. Basically, you get to a floor, there's 4 doors. Which one do you go in, right? Like, that's basically very much lends itself to letting it unfurl on its own terms and not trying to overthink it or even to understand it fundamentally.
Yeah. So did you get much use out of the Abyss section, which is a place you can sort of end up in by accident, maybe? But
yes. I have a lot to say about the Abyss section, and maybe we just go ahead and swing over to questions then. I mean, it might be the thing to do here. Unless you have any other thoughts about things you...
Well, no, because I think mainly I have a question, which is there seems to be a disproportionately large amount of material.
It's a lot.
About the Abyss. It's like half the book is about this dark abyss that you can sort of stray into on the 5th floor, 4th floor?
From the 4th floor up, yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, I can see the value of it, but is it really, like, was this a Kickstarter bonus that got out of hand? Something like that? Was like, what's up with this?
I have so many thoughts on this. Just to give listeners a better understanding of what we're talking about, everything we've talked about up to this point is only like half the book. And it's the entire adventure, basically.
Yeah.
The other half of the book is a series of 15 encounters, each of them explained in like multiple paragraphs of text, basically a whole page each. 15 encounters that you can have in this extra dimensional space the player characters can wander into in the dungeon. Individually, I think 90% of them are really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The 2 that my characters ran into were particularly fun. One was they floated into this island in the abyss upon which was a little house with a happy family in it, but it turns out that it's actually like this parasitic psychovore creature that feeds off good emotions that they had to kind of deal with. And then the other was this titanic spider-like thing it's trying to understand humanity, and it's crafting mannequins.
Oh, the mannequins
so
one, yes,
like
that's
just
the highlight, yes, I think.
There's swarms of mannequins all over the place. And if they find the player characters, they want to study them more closely, right? I thought those were really fun. There's a lot of other fun ones in there. The question you're asking, though, is this feels like it's coming out of nowhere, right? Like it feels like it feels completely out of nowhere.
I mean, well...
Something totally different.
Yeah,
right?
I don't know that it feels like completely out of nowhere, because it's sort of the appearance of the tower in the village is never explained, but it sort of implies it came out of nowhere, and so the abyss is the nowhere it comes from, maybe.
Is the nowhere it comes from.
Yeah, which is fine.
That's exactly right.
That's fine.
Yeah.
And I do like a couple of the bits in it. Like, I like the fact there are genuine exits from several, like the mannequins one, it can tell you the way out if you give it the right gift. So it's not just a screw you rolled unluckily in the abyss room kind of thing. But it's a lot, man. Like, it's a lot of pages.
It is. Here's the thing. In practical terms, the player characters are likely only ever going to see 1 or 2 of these things. It's unlikely they're ever going to see more of it. In which case, it doesn't really matter that there's so much there.
That's true.
It just feels like a little side thing, right? But sort of alluding to what you said a minute ago, what I really think the Abyss section does is it explains the whole module. It's sort of by implication. It's not like explicitly explaining anything, but what I think happened in this module, it's so strange and it's so weird, and it's precisely because the wizard is just another one of these. It's like the 16th thing in the Abyss, right? It's just another one of them, and it's the one that the player characters are initially interacting with because it's managed to come into our world. But the existence of the rest of it is sort of essentially just as kind of like teach you what's going on here. Like, this is just to show that this whole thing is just like a horror from the abyss, and you don't have to really understand it. It's not meant to be understandable. It's unknowable, but this is where it came from. And the reason why you know it came from here is because you're about to go into it and see some other shit that could have come through instead of this. I think that's sort of the idea here. And so in that sense, it fits. I feel like you can never have too much good stuff. So it doesn't, so like its existence feels in an indirect way, like it sort of explains everything. There are some fun encounters in there, and you could absolutely just like use it for parts. You know, there's a lot of good stuff in there if you just want to use it in some other adventure, right?
I often need to plunge characters into, extra dimensional netherworlds. So to be honest, I could be rating this for some time.
It's almost like a quasi supplement in that sense, or source book. And it created a level of intrigue. The whole Abyss thing was such a big... When it happened in our 3-session run, it was just another one of those like mind-blowing things for the players. They were like, "Oh shit, what's going on now?" So the module's filled with that, right?
Yeah.
So that was just another instance of it.
Nice.
From here, why don't we go ahead and go to the Chain Lightning round? Tom.
From the opening notes, this module is gruesome. There is gore, body horror, and other disturbing content. Set boundaries with the players, and allow them to set boundaries with you.
I am a sucker for adventures with food menus, and the bakery in Canny has a lovely little menu that makes me want to eat baked goods.
Sam's unable to articulate what the wizard is wanted for, but he shakes his fist in mild anger at him anyway.
Of a barn in Canny, dimly lit, the door is painted with streaks of blood. In the center of the barn there is a dead cow. It has been torn open along its stomach like a peeled orange. Its organs pattern the hay-covered floor.
If a character is ever alone in a room with the wizard, he picks them off, describes something running at them very fast, being yanked up into the ceiling, dragged through a vent, etc. Then move on. There is no need to worry about them anymore.
Of a chest in the dungeon, if the characters put their ears up to the chest and listen for a few moments, they can hear soft noises coming from inside. The chest has grown out of the floor, wet, sticky strands still connecting it to the ground. It opens with an uncomfortably moist pop.
Oh no.
Let's go to the expert delve. Hi listeners, Jason here. If you're enjoying this podcast, you should support it on Patreon. We here at The Gauntlet love making these shows, but there are a lot of costs associated with making them, and we depend on your Patreon support to cover those costs. A monthly $2 pledge doesn't seem like much, but it goes a long way towards us being able to make these podcasts. And if you pledge $6, you get early access to all the releases coming out of Gauntlet Publishing. At any given time, our Patreon feed has scenarios and playbooks for The Between, new mysteries for Brindlewood Bay, incursions for Trophy Dark and Trophy Gold, and more. $6 patrons also get early access to our big standalone game releases. We have 4 big games coming in 2023. Arkham Herald, Public Access, The Silt vs. RPG, and Moonlight Vale. And you'll get them early and at the best possible price if you make that $6 pledge. Remember, we can't do any of this without you, so head over to patreon.com/gauntlet and pledge today. Thanks. It's the Expert Delve. Listeners, we have come today to make you into a better GM. There is no GM skill more critical to the smooth running of a session than spotlight management, and that is our topic for today. This particular module has some stark instances where the player characters can be separated from one another, and spotlight management is key to making it work. And so I thought that would make a good topic for today. And just to emphasize what I'm talking about here, in the module, it's possible for some of the characters to be in the abyss while the others are not.
Oh, yeah.
You have to really know your spotlight management. So we're going to talk about spotlight management. This is one of the things that I love. It's a topic I love. It's something I think I'm particularly good at. I get lots of compliments about how I pace scenes and manage spotlight. I don't think we've ever talked about it as directly in this show.
Maybe not, which surprises me because it's a large amount of GMing. So
it really is.
Yeah.
It's so important to good GMing, right? Like it's such a critical skill. And I'll tell you what, every horrible game I've been a player in, almost always at a convention, by the way, it's been horrible precisely because the GM has no instinct for spotlight management, where I'm just sitting there for 30 minutes, literally saying nothing because the GM has not cut the scene.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
It's often on.
It's the solution to a lot of problems. It can also be fun, and you can do like different things with this. Not necessarily even messing with the story, but the way it's like they say, a film is made 3 times, and the third time is in the
Yes.
edit. And something similar is true, I think, with spotlight management in games. But where do you want to start with this? This is a big topic.
It is a big topic. Based off both of our sets of notes, I think what might be a good way of dividing up the conversation is between general best practices and then maybe games that mechanically enforce spotlight management.
Okay. Yeah.
So if we stick with best practices for a moment, I think the key is to keep the spotlight moving around the table. You find a good place to cut a scene and then you check in with another player. After 5 to 10 minutes with that player, you find another good stopping point and then move to another player or check back in quickly with the player you initially cut away from. As a general matter, I just think this is the best way to pace out your scenes and your session. It's very important because, like I noted before, when players get bored, it ruins their experience. And the boredom is almost always because they're just sitting there, not doing anything, not being talked to.
Yeah.
Moving around the table also gives you a chance as the GM to think about what happens next. This is so important. Often, I need a minute to think about what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so if you cut and you have a minute to kind of think about what's going to happen to that other guy.
It's and it makes you look clever as well. Like I had to do this just yesterday. I wasn't sure what the person was going to see while they're wandering around a village. So I went, I will come back to you in a moment. And I could see around the table, they're thinking, this guy is a master of suspense. But no, I was just thinking.
Exactly. But also, a sort of related idea, it gives the play of the other players a chance to affect what you narrate for the cutaway character. If I'm not totally sure what's going to happen and I cut away, though I certainly make it look more like dramatic pacing than me not knowing what's going on, as you noted, when I cut away, whatever's happening with the other player might inform what's going to happen with the previous player, right? Like they might say something that like pings my brain. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I'm going to make that part of the scene. And you just sort of start to build this much more overall cohesive, coherent, almost cinematic type of scene and pacing. And I just think it's really lovely. Once you get really good at the technique of just sort of moving the spotlight around the table, you start to be able to use it in really skillful ways that take your GMing to a whole other level. One of the ways that I do it is by creating what I call little cliffhangers throughout a session. You just create little tiny cliffhangers so everyone always wants to know what's going to happen. They're always engaged and they can't wait for it to get back to them. And indeed, they're not going to have to wait long. It just keeps the energy level so high. It keeps the investment really high. And it's a technique, listeners, that is so worth your time. Learn spotlight management, get better at it, actively practice it. It's going to help you so much. So best practices as a general rule, keep things moving around the table. I find that some games have natural cutting points. Powered by the Apocalypse games and Carl from Brittlewood games, which are mostly what I run, they have lots of natural cutting points, particularly after dice hit the table. In a PBTA game, it's very easy to let dice happen, and before you narrate something, you cut and then leave them on the edge there. And that's doable in a PBTA game because a die roll in a PBTA game accounts for a lot of fiction.
Yeah.
It's not like we're having to go back and forth swinging swords at a monster. The die roll encompasses a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and also there's something for the player to think about during that turn. Like if they go to 10+, they can go turn to plan their dramatic
because they're going to have to narrate, right?
Or if it's 7 to 9, then they're sitting there choosing looking through the options. I think so. Yeah.
Precisely. But PBTA games, CFB games, lots of great places for what I call the little cliffhanger. But I think you can do this in more traditional games too. Perception checks are a terrific opportunity to do a cut. You let them do a perception check, and then you start to narrate what they discover, but maybe cut away at the moment of highest tension. I don't run traditional games too often, but whenever I have, I like to let them do their check, and then I begin describing the sounds of something coming around the corner or whatever it is that they're going to see. And then I cut at that point.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Right? Like before I show them what it is.
Yeah,
right?
you've got to decide what's going to be that moment of maximum tension. So, as you know, I run a weekly game of Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Indeed.
And in that has a weird, well, it's not weird, but there is a mechanical quirk in that when a wizard casts a spell, the result kind of gives them, there's always a whole bunch of different options that could happen from a magic spell. Usually the higher the better. And if you let them roll the dice and then cut away, then they've got like however long it takes to sit there looking through their options, then that's not tense. So I think it's much better to have them describe how their spell manifests if they've already rolled that, and then don't let them roll. They're committed to casting the spell, and then you see how good it's going to be when you come back. Another best practice is you need to think about where that cutting point comes.
I love what you said about the moment of highest tension. That's a great phrase because that's exactly what it is. And I think that's actually probably A pretty decent segue to this other idea that we should talk about, which is games that actually have mechanical pacing built in, where the mechanics of the game actually help you out with that. So what are your thoughts there?
Two systems came to mind when we decided to talk about Spotlight Management. One of those is, predictably enough for me, a drama system. We'll come back to that in a second.
Yeah.
But the other is the much more recent Black Sword hack, which is a kind of OSRE, but Elric sword and sorcery thing. It's got demon-based magic.
I don't know much about this one. But I have players in my games who play it, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah, it's pretty new. And the thing that got me, I was sort of hooked on page one, is because it has simultaneously mechanical and organic Spotlight Management built into the rules, because nearly the first thing it tells you is this game happens in turns, always. So sometimes those turns are combat turns, and maybe they're a few seconds long or whatever. But the turn could also be a year long, and it's like, okay, a year's passing, it's your turn, what do you do and where do you go? And it even sort of has what's borderline a joke, like normally in a turn you can move a certain distance and take one action, which is going to be a lot further in a month than it is in 10 seconds. And so just giving you that idea that everything happens in turns, and I don't think it really gets too much into specifying how you decide whose turn it is, because that's not necessary. It's just this idea that everyone gets an equal number of turns, and that is, at a very basic level, Spotlight Management.
I adore that. And let me tell you why I adore it. This is off the top of my head after what you've just described to me. What it does is it sets a certain expectation about scope, about pacing, about the nature of the gameplay. It seems like it would make the overall gameplay more cinematic, which I think is terrific,
yeah, because if you think about a Moorcock novel, a lot of the time it'll go from being this sort of second by second Mortal Kombat kind of thing to, like traversing the course of years in a couple of paragraphs.
Yeah, exactly, right, yeah.
You're right, it sets that expectation. Again, it's that programming through language, which is not the subject of this expert delve, but semiotics and connotation and all that. To move on to Drama System, though, that's a game where the standard method, and the one that I used in my game, Malandros, which is set in 19th century Brazil, that's not relevant, you basically write down each character's name on a index card. It's that kind of game, writing things on index cards. Shuffle it.
We love those games. Yeah.
And you flip them, and so at random, it's just someone's turn. It's that character's turn to be in a scene, and their player says, where it is, when it is, who else is there, this kind of thing. And so that's randomized. And when the cards run out, the GM sets a scene of their own, and it all spaces out nicely like that. Now, the reason that I use this for my game is because I think the randomness is important. And the reason I'm mentioning it now is even if you don't want to use the system, it's good to have in mind when you're being the GM and deciding whose turn it is next, is you don't want to always go clockwise around the table, because then it's easy to sort of switch off. When you know it's not your turn for a long time, you can tune out a bit. Even with the best will in the world, you might tune out a bit. But if you never know whose turn it's going to be, then you have to stay engaged and you have to be on your toes. Especially if you get a slightly PvP game, where it might matter who gets to go next.
Yeah.
And the other thing I want to mention here, which I think is very transferable to non-mechanical Spotlight Management, is a rule I instituted after a lot of thinking after playtests, which is you cannot skip your turn. Because when you can skip a turn as a player, you'd think it would be more relaxing, but in fact it creates more pressure. You feel like you have to deliver, you have to have a good idea, otherwise you just go, oh no, don't worry, just come back to me later. But of course what happens is you just end up not really being it doesn't balance out. But if everybody's getting an equal number of turns, an equal amount of spotlight, and if everybody can just chill out and relax for 5 seconds, then take your time. Another rule actually that I have in the game is until the player asks for advice, you're not allowed to jump in with advice. Everybody just relax and wait for them to say what they're doing. It's fine. And once you know that you can't skip your turn, again, it actually becomes less stressful, because it doesn't have to be perfect every time. Sometimes you could just go, I hit the orc with my axe. Sometimes that's what you're going to do, and that's fine. That is another part of Spotlight Management, is sometimes it's fun to put people on the spot with oh no, they're coming for you, what do you do? But other times you've got to be there to help people manage their own moment under that spotlight and help them come up with something that they're going to enjoy and remember positively later, not like...
Well, it's setting an expectation, right? I mean, you're totally setting an expectation, and I really love that. And I remember that about Malandros, and like Paint the Scene works the same way, right? Like this is not so much it's kind of a spotlight thing.
It is a bit,
because like the Paint the Scene, which we've talked about a million times, I'm not going to go into it here, The practical effect of the table is it does keep people engaged because
You've
because
answered the
it's not your
question.
scene. It creates an expectation that you're going to answer the question. And sometimes the answer is the simple answer, and that's okay, but you're still engaged, you're still there. But it also is a way of mitigating spotlight problems because when two characters are in a scene, I like to give them more time, maybe I might stretch that scene to 15 minutes or so, like longer than I normally would because there's two. But that still means there's a third or fourth player who are not going to be in that scene. And so Paint the Scene actually helps mitigate that a little bit because they get to still talk and say something in the scene, even though they're not right there in it, So that's actually a mechanical enforcement of spotlight management or inducement to spotlight management. Good game design truly keeps this in mind, right? There's something to be said about techniques and best practices and just general skills that will help you in your GMing and particularly related to spotlight management. And I encourage everybody listening who GMs games to actively think about it. But truly, I think a really thoughtfully designed game will also consider it.
Yeah.
It's a good topic. It's a great topic at the GM level, at the game design level. I think there's another thing I want to talk about here before we leave the topic, though, which is it's a different but slightly related topic, which is the montage.
Yeah.
Everything we've been talking about up to this point, I think, can be boiled down essentially to this idea of cinematic storytelling, right? Because that's really what you're accomplishing in it from a storytelling perspective. Yes, you're keeping player boredom at a minimum and you're enhancing investment and all that stuff, but you're creating a cinematic story, and that's another good reason to do good spotlight management. The montage is very connected to this. I love a montage in a really particular instance where the players have rolled some dice and they're going to get a certain result. They're entitled to a certain result. And rather than me being the person who narrates everything or one player being the person who narrates everything, I let the whole table in a round go through and narrate a montage for the scene. They've just killed the monster. If you're playing a game where where die rolls are minimum and you just kind of roll once or twice and you kill the monster, or they break into a jail or they narrowly escape the King's Guard. There's some sort of sequence that they're doing. The montage is really great here. You kick it off by basically having one player describe how the scene starts from the point of view of their character. You have the next player build on that, again, from the point of view of their character, and so forth, with the last player describing the final outcome that they're entitled to.
That's great. That's very stealable.
Yeah, we break into the jail, or we escape the King's Guard. Whatever you're entitled to, that last player puts the little cherry on top and ends it. And what's great about the montage is it makes everything feel a little bit more organic. It makes everything feel a little bit more collaborative. It is a spotlight management tool in the sense that everyone's getting to participate, and it creates a cinematic feel for what should be a big moment in the story. And in a lot of ways, the montage is a reward, and it's a way of focusing on the really fun stuff, And so a related idea, but another thing worth incorporating into your games is the montage scene. This is how combat and Trophy Gold works. In Trophy Gold, you roll once.
Yeah, and then everyone everyone
just kind of narrates like a montage, how the round goes. Yeah. And it's just another way of doing spotlight management.
Yeah.
I love this topic so much.
That's terrific. That's good stuff.
It's a great topic. It's so good. I was going to put it in Companion Adventures. I decided not to. But if this is a topic that interests you listeners, just go watch one of my YouTubes and just see how I do it. I would say Tom as well, but Tom doesn't have any videos on YouTube.
No, so not that many.
that I'm aware of.
Come down to the weekly DCC game and marvel at a man just about keeping 7 players at a time.
Oh my word! That's talk about spotlight management. Yeah, that's great.
Oh, that reminds me. That's another thing I didn't throw in. Is I think in larger groups it could be valuable to mentally clump players who are sitting next to each other together, because they'll talk to each other while you're not talking to them, and they'll already have a plan when you get back to them. So that's my tip for that.
Very good.
Anyway,
anything else about this topic, Tom?
Well, actually, yes, but no, because time is limited.
Yeah,
but we'll come back to
we
this,
could go for a bit. Spotlight management. Practice it. Do it. Let's go to the Companion Adventures. It's Companion Adventures. We both have some music options here. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, mine's arguably bang obvious for a creepy horror adventure, but I suddenly just sort of remembered the Suspiria soundtrack by Goblin from 1977.
By Goblin, yeah.
Which, right?
It's good.
It's creepy. Mm-hmm. It's a bit weird. It has weird sound qualities in it as well, which I think aids the sort of alien nature of the tower, maybe. How about you?
My music is, I'm going with some synthwave today. I was going to recommend Carl Casey generally. Carl Casey is a synthwave artist that I've been obsessed with ever since I started putting together the Spotify playlist for my game Public Access. I've been super, super obsessed with Carl Casey. And as a general matter, I think his music is a great fit for this module. But I do have 3 specific tracks for you. One is Mysterious Green Fluid. Another is Videodrome. And then we have Klendathu Drop.
Man, I haven't watched Videodrome in a while. Maybe I should,
That's a good movie as well.
Okay, I have a game recommendation, which is The Skyblind Spire, reviewed some time ago on this very podcast. Basically, if you want a weird wizard tower, but you don't want a scary, disgusting wizard tower, then go get Skyblind Spire. Yeah.
I have a book, Video Night, which is a book from 2016 by Adam Césaire. This is a really quick read. If for no other reason, just it's a quick read. Go read it. It's a lot of fun. It's about a group of kids right before they go off to college doing their weekly Friday schlocky video night. It takes place in the 80s, and they go rent a video every Friday and they watch and drink beer and stuff. I'm recommending it, though, because the plot involves aliens that use you to incubate their babies.
Okay.
Just as an alternative to the obvious companion adventure, which I'm going to recommend, which is Alien.
Yeah.
It's another take on this alien impregnation story. I would recommend Alien, which seems to be the most direct influence on a wizard. But also, its forerunner, Dark Star, might be worth watching. Not for the content necessarily, but because Dan O'Bannon, who was one of the co-writers of Alien, this was the movie he did before that.
Yeah.
And it was presumably an influence on Alien. It's a little funnier. It's more of a comedy in some ways, but it has some of the same like themes and elements. And it's a fun movie. And John Carpenter's first movie too, incidentally.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I think that's all I've got. Anything else?
No, that's it from me. I'm afraid I was quite light on the companions this time. I don't know. It's weird. But I think maybe because it's the sort of, in some ways, this format of an adventure is so ingrained in a lot of things. It's hard to choose something to recommend.
Yeah, well, I'm just going with things I love.
Yeah.
Things I love that are tentatively connected to it at this point. Yeah.
Don't give it away.
Or tangentially, I guess. Listeners, that's our show. If you enjoy Fear of a Black Dragon, you can... Where's this going? This is not how this goes.
That's not it.
Listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter for a little while longer, I'm sure, at Gauntlet RPG. Our website is gauntlet-rpg.com. We would love your support on Patreon. We have revamped our Patreon in recent weeks, and along with our revamped Discord. So go find us in those places. The Patreon is patreon.com/gauntlet, and Discord will have a link in the show notes. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks, of course, to our Eldritch Extra Dimensional editor, Rich Rogers. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.